Kira Edelmayer is currently a doctoral student at the Andrássy University Budapest, and her dissertation deals with spas as sites of diplomacy. Her publications include the biographies of nobles and female diplomats, as well as several publications on the secret diplomacy in the Bohemian Bath Triangle. Her co-presenter is Marija Wakounig, who is a professor of East and Southeast European history at the University of Vienna. Her research focuses on the history of nobility, diplomatic history, history of science, history of the symbols of power and state symbols in Eastern Europe, gender history, cultural history, as well as the history of the Alps-Adriatic region from the Middle Ages until the present. She has published widely on these topics, and the title of their talk is The Concept of Congress Diplomacy During the Era of the Holy Alliance. So, Maria and Kira, please, the floor is yours.
Dobre jutro, guten Morgen, good morning. First of all, we would like to thank you for inviting us to this distinguished conference and also for the kind introduction by Rok Hvala Lepa. Our speech about the concept of Congress diplomacy during the era of the Holy Alliance takes place exactly 200 years after the closure of the Congress of Laibach or Ljubljana. We will speak in a language that was not yet one of the Congress languages at the time. English was first admitted at the Berlin Congress in 1878. The International Congress participants did not speak Slovenian in 1821 either, but French and German.
We would also like to apologize if we repeat certain parts of the previous keynote speech, which was quite interesting. And secondly, our PowerPoint presentation is by no means, if it's there, by no means as beautiful and as informative as the ones yesterday. But yeah, I give the floor to.
And it was provided.
It was provided, yeah.
Yes. Let me say a few introducing words. Between the Congress of Vienna 1815 and the outbreak of the First World War 1914, the monarchs of the European Concept met more than 200 times just to ensure the maintenance of the international system of peacekeeping. With the exception of a few armed conflicts in the heart of Europe and Western Europe and on the Balkan Peninsula, this more or less succeeded. Before ending the First World War with a peace treaty, the British Foreign Ministry wanted to know how to conduct a peace conference after such a long peace period in Europe. The world of 1918 was not the same as in 1914, when a local war evolved to a grave war, which eventually led to the First World War. Therefore, the Foreign Ministry asked the young historian Charles Webster from the University of Liverpool to research about the Congress of Vienna in 1815 to create a so-called blueprint for the upcoming Congress in Paris. Webster only had half a year time to write about it. Even though it was written for officials of man of action rather than historians, those so-called officials ignored Webster's opus at the Paris Peace Conference. What he did not expect was he wrote the first source-based monograph about the Congress of Vienna. The parallels between Vienna and Paris were quite interesting, as they had similar prehistory, blood war on several continents, ideological reassessment, the will for everlasting peace, and a similar conference organization. A council for the four most important victorious powers. Vienna had Great Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia. Paris had the United States, Great Britain, France, and Italy. Those big four made all preliminary decisions for the respective post-war orders. In both cases, expert commissions discussed about details. Yet comparing Paris 1919 with Vienna 1814 is not exactly possible, especially considering the way France was not snubbed, but actually emerged stronger from the process. A member of the Holy Alliance and a fully reaffirmed member of the Concept of Europe from 1818. As already mentioned, a young historian created a source-based matrix for the diplomacy and how to organize. Speak launched on September 26, 1815 in Paris. The founding act was followed by impressive military and troop parades, which culminated in the field service in the midst of the Russian army. This was a demonstration of Christian monarchical solidarity. In his monograph, Pomp and Politics, Johannes Paulmann advised that the Holy Alliance brought a fundamental structural change for international relations. The alliance aim was not to establish a temporary and goal-focused connection, but to have a supertemporal connection between three monarchs with the aim to have a political cooperation in the spirit of Christian faith. The Christian faith should legitimize the God-given political order. Metternich was extremely skeptical of this union. He also changed the original draft, which spoke of an alliance of peoples and armies. Metternich turned it in the final version into an alliance of rulers who would stand above the peoples and armies. Furthermore, the founding treaty from 1815 was not signed by the ministers, but by the three monarchs themselves. And in the follow-up monarchical meetings, they always appeared like the three wise men, even searching the public eye. Therefore, disparaging opinions from political contemporaries stating that it was a theaterkulisse were quite true, which is of no surprise. A theater, pomp, and ceremony were the bread of a successful Congress diplomacy. The Holy Alliance era lasted from 1815 until the outbreak of the Crimean War in 1853, being embedded in the Congress regime of the Viennese order. Leading statesmen and monarchs meet each other over 50 times in nearly 40 years to discuss plurilateral ways to ensure peacekeeping and the monarchical order. The preferred places of encounter were Berlin, followed by Vienna, Paris, London, and only for one time, St. Petersburg. Congress cities as Aachen, Troppau, Opava, Laibach, Ljubljana, and Verona shared the same fate of singularity as St. Petersburg. The concept of Europe, or European concept of the great powers, was also established at this time, but it had not a unilateral nomination from 1813 until the end of the World War I. Terms like European system, Great Alliance, Union, Europäische Allianz, Europäisches Konzert, Europäisches Konzert der Großmächte are used in Congress protocols over the years. The usage of different names did not change the meaning. Finding a consensus while negotiating, similar to music, in which rhythm and harmony are essential for the outcome, achieving something de concert on the diplomatic floor. Now, Kira will take over, please.
Well, thank you so much. While the 17th and 18th century used mediation and a conference and arbitration for conflict resolution, using the Koncept term for a sign of peace culture of the Viennese state system was a new approach. Having the right of foreign policy framework was of importance, such as using the Koncept term for the diplomatic voting process while conserving peace between 1813-15 and 1818. Thank you. Right before the Congress of Vienna and until the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle. It also was having an anti-revolutionary intervention practice for the European concert between 1818 and 1823. This also led to a trial period of the Holy Alliance between Aix-la-Chapelle and Verona, as many happenings occurred. The Greek Independence War showed the boundaries of not only Metternich's principle of legitimacy, but also of Alexander's non-denominational diplomacy, and experiencing a consolidation phase of the concert of power between 1823 and 1841. A transformation or a secularization of the Holy Alliance happened just a tiny bit earlier. Under Metternich, it transformed from a religious to a more legitimate anti-revolutionary instrument, which led to an unequal simultaneity and discordant notes in the concert. The Congress of München-Grätz, or Mnichovo, in 1833 already showed the drift between the three monarchs, bringing in a 2-decade-long swan song of the alliance. This led to hardened positions and ideological formation in both the concert as well as the Holy Alliance. Well, comparing the Congress diplomatic concept during the era of the Holy Alliance of nearly 40 years goes beyond timely and scientific reasons. Although our colleague Karin Schneider has achieved a masterpiece with her digital edition of the 4 congresses between 1818 and 1822, they are still not equally scientifically processed. Therefore, I will focus on Aix-la-Chapelle, as Heinz Dukat quite recently wrote a monograph about it, which was in 2018. Well, the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle took place from September 29 until November 21st of 1818, so around 54 days of duration. And the final act of the Congress of Vienna already stated that the monarchs should hold recurring meetings to talk about issues at hand. The first opportunity was given in 1818, exactly 3 years after Vienna ended, and the monarchs had to figure out if the Allied troops should withdraw from France, and it also should be dealt with France's place in the European concert and how one would contain revolutionary democratic movements. While Vienna and the follow-up congresses after Aix-la-Chapelle became famous for their length and were really long affairs, this Congress stands out above all due to its brevity. With a duration of less than 2 months and only 48 conferences, it seemed to be a fast affair. Well, but then there's a question, why Aix-la-Chapelle? Why not choosing Vienna, Paris, or Berlin? All 3 cities would have been quite fitting venues for such an important event. And even though the Tsar was quite in favor of Vienna and wouldn't have minded being there again, the search for the it spot was not yet over. Both Austria and Prussia were still recuperating from near financial ruin due to the war, but also due to the rather lavish Congress of Vienna. Berlin was still not as splendid as Vienna. There was far too much war damage, and in a certain sense, the follow-up Congress should be a quieter one than its predecessor, far away from the metropolitan hustle and bustle. In the end, only assumptions can be made why Aix-la-Chapelle was chosen, most likely also due to geographical but also financial reasons. Geographically spoken, the venue was only a small space away from the French border. And another specialty, it has been the coronation city of the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, but it was also quite well versed in hosting peace treaty meetings, such as the treaties of Aix-la-Chapelle of 1686 and 1748 show. The last special feature of Aix-la-Chapelle was, and still is, it is a spa town. In 1818, it was the spa town. And therefore also giving a bit of a leisure movement to Aix-la-Chapelle, even though it should be a more serious occasion than Vienna. Being the place of action not only led to an economic boom in the city, but also to a huge price hike on everything, something even Metternich complained about. As Aix-la-Chapelle was at the time not the largest city, with hardly any accommodation, it is well documented where each of the monarchs and their delegations were staying during the Congress. So who participated? All members of the Holy Alliance were present. Even though the Congress's host was Prussia, it was without a doubt Metternich who staged the whole Congress. He met for preliminary talks with Prince Hardenberg, who was for Prussia, with Count Münster for Great Britain, and with Count Capodistria for Russia, to talk about the agendas of the Congress. While the meetings with the former two were held in Koblenz, the ones with the latter were in Franzensbad, Františko Lažne, as well in Karlsbad, Karlovy Vary. During this time, nearly all topics and positions were decided upon, making those quite successful meetings and showing that Metternich indeed deserved being called the coachman of Europe. In Aix-la-Chapelle, Francis was accompanied by Metternich as well as Count Bernstorff, Frederick William by Hardenberg, and Alexander by Prince Nesselrode and the aforementioned Capodistria. France was represented by the Duke de Richelieu, no longer Talleyrand, and Great Britain by Lord Castlereagh and Duke of Wellington. The entourage of all delegations was approximately over 100 people, as I've already mentioned, it is known where all the participants stayed, even the servants. With the Congress being perfectly orchestrated, even due to etiquette's reason, the first to arrive at the venue had to be the host, King Frederick William III of Prussia. Afterwards, the Austrian Emperor Francis, and with another day to spare, Tsar Alexander. Both arriving guests and guest monarchs were greeted by the Prussian king and wore uniforms of their Prussian regiments. The monarch with the highest rank was Francis I, as the former and last emperor on the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. His arrival was cheered by the population. The starting session of the Congress was hosted by Hardenberg's quarter at the Markt. After that, the Congress rotated between Hardenberg's and Metternich's accommodation on a daily basis, with a starting point between 10 and 11 a.m. and the finishing touches around 2 to 3 p.m. With the exception of Austria, every delegation had 2 delegates. Duke de Richelieu was involved with the sessions right from the start. In a parallel setting, smaller, informal groups of experts conferred with each other. The result today, that the Congress was a hustle and bustle can be seen in Gent's ego documents. Not a day went by without him, as the official secretary of the Congress, meeting in private or semi-private settings and functions and with functionaries and preparing documents. In the official 48 sessions, while number 43 was given twice and the secret ones were, well, the state secret, 11 topics of importance were discussed. Yes, I thank you so much. I know. I will come now to the conclusion of Aachen and then my concluding remarks. Aachen was the birth hour of the European Pentarchy. Despite the inner turmoil, it existed until the last Congress dealt with European issues only and saw English being the negotiation language of a Congress for the first time, which would be in Berlin in 1878. In a comparison to Vienna, Aix-la-Chapelle was a smaller, quieter, and not a public event. Maybe this led to its pleasant, like Metternich would say, plus joli, and cozy atmosphere. Another feature was that everything was shut, like there was no information getting out. And if there were leaks, they were plugged immediately. Well, onto our concluding remarks. The Congress of Diplomacy the Congress Diplomacy of the Viennese Order gave the concert of the European powers continuity and stability, which also benefited the Holy Alliance and its members as well. Whether the Holy Alliance had its own concept of Congress diplomacy is not answerable due to the varied actors. Imagine only the mystical initiator Alexander and the pragmatic logistic Metternich, or even the wrath-like Capodistria and Gens or Hardenberg. The Holy Alliance found its secularization with the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle, with reduced mass manifestations. Politically, it started with the Congress with the Greek War for Independence, as independent state interests were put above peacekeeping and non-denominational ones. The proverbial coffin nail to the European encompassing character of the Holy Alliance was the outbreak of the July Revolution of 1830 in France. Even though the alliance was reactivated in Münchengrätz in 1833, the inner alienations were far too far advanced, despite the Viennese order. From a historical retrospective, the alliance's final breakup in 1853 was already predominated. A constant aspect of the Holy Alliance were its main characters, who not only stayed in the same, partook in all monarch congresses and gave the alliance and the congresses its face. All three monarchs experienced the alliance's heyday. With the exception of the Spiritus Rector, Alexander I, who died in 1825, the remaining two monarchs also saw the demise of it. The increasing its significance was accelerated by revolutions as well as by the national emancipation process. Chancellors like Metternich, foreign ministers like Nesselrode, and influential advisors such as Hardenberg stayed mostly the same between 1815 and 1822. Perhaps Hardenberg's death in Verona in 1822 could have been seen as a premonition. Thank you very much for your attention.